welcome to the Sanders Review. My name is Caleb Sanders, and today we are going to be jumping into a spoiler-free and spoiler-filled review of the first book of Discworld by Terry Pratchett. If you've never heard of Discworld, Discworld is one of the most ridiculous comedic fantasy universes ever created. It is part of what is called absurdism, and in literature, this absurdism takes the form of very bizarre, very creative, very chaotic storylines and worlds. And it is intentionally ridiculous to the point where this Discworld is a disc that is sitting on top of the back of 4 giant elephants that are standing on top of a cosmic turtle that is swimming through space. Absurdism. Another example of this absurdism is that on this Discworld there are philosophical societies that they spend their entire lives trying to determine this giant turtle, what sex it is, how big it is, where it's heading. One branch even argues that it is heading towards this mating ground where there will be a big bang. Get it? And a lot of the books in this series explore themes of humanity, themes of society and religion and philosophy to very ridiculous lengths. So I want to spend a little bit doing some spoiler-free review elements of the first book in the series, which is called The Colour of Magic. The Colour of Magic starts off in the booming metropolis called Ankh-Morpork. It's 2 cities next to this one river, and they've formed this one giant metropolis. And this river coming through is described that there's clean water coming in and there is sludge going out. And that will tell you all you need to know about the hygiene and sanitation of this city. It is made up of tons of guilds and people just going about their lives and recognizing that there are ridiculous things around them, but embracing that. There's an assassin's guild and a thieves guild and a merchant's guild eventually. And there's all these different guilds and groups. There's even a watchman group that takes care of the city. Later in one of the books, Guards, they become some key central figures, which many people say that Guards is a great place to start reading Discworld. They could be right. I love reading The Colour of Magic first because it introduces you to this chaotic world that Terry Pratchett was discovering as he wrote it. One thing about this world is that octarine is the 8th color. It's the color of magic. It's described as like a green, yellow, purpley color. As Terry Pratchett wrote this first book, it is a little meandering as it talks about these characters and what the plot becomes. There is no set major plot of the first book. But what it is a character study following a couple of characters that get thrown into some very outlandish but seemingly familiar situations. Terry Pratchett wrote Discworld to be a parody of the Conan the Barbarian universe, of the Dungeons and Dragons universe. And he does an absurdist, amazing job doing that. I have seldom laughed out loud reading books. And I can probably say reading Discworld has made me laugh the most out of any series I've ever read. And I'm only like 7 or 8 books into the series. There are a lot of real-world references throughout this first book and throughout most of the books. Later on, there's references to the Great Pyramids. There's an entire book that follows that, to the Trojan Wars. In The Colour of Magic, there's references to real-world things like cameras and insurance policies and even historic references, which I love, like something called a caravanserai, which was a merchant hostel hotel that were spaced along the Silk Road in more ancient times. And so I appreciated reading about that as I am a history teacher. Throughout the entire series, Discworld becomes this living, thriving world that you get to explore, and The Colour of Magic is a great place to start because you are experiencing it as Terry Pratchett was actually writing it. But The Colour of Magic really excels in its characters. You have one main character, named Two Flowers, who is a very clueless, naive tourist who's just going around experiencing all that this world has to offer and is very innocent in that process. You have a very jaded, reluctant wizard guide who is just trying to survive in this world for good reasons. You have a very overly protective walking chest that walks on hundreds of little legs. When I first read, I thought it might be like ant legs, but no, they're described as like doll legs, and absurdism. Even has a giant tongue and just lays traps for people. It's a whole thing. And then you have another character that comes in periodically throughout this story, and that is the character of Death, who is portrayed as a overworked project manager who's just trying to keep up his schedule as chaos ensues throughout this book and subsequent books. This really turns into an adventure story that is character driven, and you really learn a lot about us. If you think about looking at these characters and you're reading about these polar opposites, one, you have this naive character who's looking at everything good in the world and everything enjoyable and fun and unique and beautiful, but you also have this other character who is jaded and just trying to survive, as he knows so much about the magical world, but he's not able to necessarily be good at it because he is a failed wizard who dropped out of school or was kicked out of school. So as you explore this book, you're going to experience all it has to offer. It ends with somewhat of a cliffhanger and jumps right into book 2, which follows the same storyline through to completion. The first 2 books, I do recommend reading them together. But this would be the end of my quick spoiler-free section. I'm still learning in booktube what constitutes spoiler-free and spoiler, so I want to stop that. If that wets your whistle a little bit, I would definitely recommend checking out The Color of Magic, followed by sequel The Light Fantastic. But starting here in a second, we're going to start off the spoiler-filled review, looking at some ridiculous elements from this book. As I mentioned, this book is really about very unique characters being put into ridiculous situations. We start off with Two Flowers, this short, round tourist who is described as having 4 eyes. When I first read it, since it was absurdism, I thought literally he had 4 eyes, and it was never commented on, but it turns out he just wears glasses and has dentures, which later on that becomes a whole thing with the hero that he meets. And Two Flowers comes from this place that is fabulously rich, that is just legend to the people of Ankh-Morpork, and he arrives because he has always heard legends and songs and stories about this unique world that surrounds that Ankh-Morpork is a part of, and he's excited to see Ankh-Morpork, and he wants to see a bar fight, and he wants to see heroes that are returning from these big, massive expeditions to find treasure and fight creatures. And so he steps into this very seedy, dirty world, looking at it through these rose-tinted glasses, thinking that everything is going to be amazing, and he twists things to view them as always being amazing. He is a constantly positive person throughout this story. He is an insurance clerk as his job, and he has what he views as just a little tiny bit of money, but because of the exchange rates, he starts overpaying the equivalent of $1,000 for like a McDonald's cup of coffee. And that gets the notice of a few people in the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild and the city because of, fear of inflation and the destruction of society as they know it, right? Along with Two Flowers comes his walking chest, which really is a character in this story. He's very protective. Periodically, you'll be following the side character who all of a sudden comes upon this chest that is sitting there and has just gold like pouring out of it. And if they go to try to take that gold, the chest will eat them. Or sometimes it has food, it has clothes, it has other things that are inside of it, because this chest is a magical chest. It's made of something called pearwood, which is a magical wood in this disc world. And you find out that this pearwood chest is actually probably the most valuable thing in the world because it could buy multiple cities, literally. And we as a reader periodically will see this chest doing something to protect Two Flowers or to come to the aid of other characters. And we know how powerful it is, but we again and again see how ridiculous it is through the eyes of these side characters who come into contact and sometimes into it through, the eating thing. Death comes into play several times because death is inevitable, and he is this character who walks around, and wizards and cats can see it. Cats, for some reason, side note, why do cats always have these amazing magical properties? You see that in Jim Butcher and multiple of his series. You see that throughout different mythologies. Maybe it goes back to the ancient Egyptians. I don't know. But anyways, death is seen by magic users and by cats. And that is where Rincewood, our main protagonist, comes to play. Rincewood is a failed, dropped-out wizard who dropped out of what was called Unseen University. You actually can see it. It's just called Unseen University because it's more magical sounding. And so Rincewood is a dropped-out wizard who has the magical robes, who has a hat that says wizard, so of course he's a wizard. He actually knows only one spell, and that spell he, through an accident, jumped into his head. Literally, the spell jumped into his head, and it is one of the 8 spells that makes up the fabric of reality. And if he ever said it, theoretically, reality could unfold. And so he's a failed wizard because he could never remember any other magic spells, because in his mind, the spell in his head was so dangerous, and it wants to sometimes just come out in dangerous situations. He has to fight to keep it inside of him. He says that he thinks all the other little spells were scared of the big spell in his head, and so he could never learn them. Maybe he was right. I don't know. But Rincewood is this character who is at one point the most determined character you will ever see in escaping what fate has for him. And he also is one of the most cowardly characters, probably because of all the things that fate has tried to throw at him in the form of death and through destruction and all that. Rincewood meets up with Two Flowers when Two Flowers goes to this seedy bar. And again, Two Flowers goes and thinks he's going to find bar fights and heroes and all that. And Rincewood basically tries to help him. He's the only one who can communicate with him in his language. And Rincewood takes on this goal of protector, of guide for Two Flowers, actually somewhat reluctantly after he is forced to by the city overlord. And as Two Flowers starts to get involved with things, I won't go into too many things, and Rincewood takes on this goal of protector, of guide for Two Flowers, actually somewhat reluctantly after he is forced to by the city overlord. I won't get into too many details because I want you to read and enjoy this book. But as Two Flowers gets involved in some scenarios, Rincewood tries to actually leave. He gets forced back. At one point, he meets Death, and Death is surprised to see Rincewood. He's like, Rincewood, you're supposed to be 500 miles away, and I'm supposed to meet you tonight for an appointment. And if Death says that, you know what appointment that means. And Rincewood's like, excuse me? And Death is like, hey, could you do me a favor and, travel 500 miles to where you're supposed to be? And Rincewood's like, no, I will not do that. He takes off. He meets up with Two Flowers, and Two Flowers is kidnapped by the Thieves Guild, who is interested in all of this wealth that he has just pouring out of his pockets and out of his chest. And Two Flowers, in his naivete, believes that these people are just so insistent and so kind that they won't take no for an answer and have him leave. They wanted to come with him. So he's looking again through his rose-colored glasses at this world. The Assassin's Guild comes in and wants to try to kill him because the overlord of the city wants to now have him killed. And it's this whole thing, this big fight breaks out, and Two Flowers is like, oh my goodness. And Two Flowers, I mentioned he was an insurance agent. At one point, he sold the bar owner some fire insurance policy for an untold amount of money, a ungodly amount of money. And as you can imagine, this bar owner decides to burn down his bar, which leads to an explosion, which leads to the entire city burning down. On escaping the city, Rincewood, Two Flowers in the chest, they meet up with this troll, which they were able to overcome through happenstance. You find out at this time that the gods of the Discworld are actually playing a game involving Rincewood, and through the luck of the gods, through how they're playing, it is determining his fate. That is one aspect of his fate. But he, through his determination, also is having some success, escaping death and what fate, literal fate, has for him. At one point, Rincewood gets separated. He finds himself up a tree. He had to use his knife to climb up this tree to escape a giant pack of wolves that's hunting him down. He's hanging up in this tree off this branch, and there's a giant snake coming for him. And Death appears and is like, yo, Rincewood, you want to just drop down and let the wolves kill you? I'll make it painless. And Rincewood is like, no, I will not. And then he gets magically saved by a dryad from the tree. And Death is like, oh my gosh, will this ever end? And through a series of events, Rincewood is able to go and finally helps meet up with and rescue Two Flowers as he is in this monster's temple, this like Cthulhu like monsters. And Two Flowers has this camera that has this little imp inside it who rapidly paints pictures, and that's what the camera pictures are. And through this camera, Two Flowers is like, oh my gosh, this is a horrible monster, I gotta take a picture of it. And the picture, actually, the flash is so brilliant that the monster flees. And everyone's like amazed by that. Even the gods are amazed by what this Cthulhu giant monster was scared of. There are several other events that transpire, but eventually Two Flowers, Rincewood, the chest, and they meet up with this hero named Huron, who is kind of a Conan the Barbarian type hero that you can definitely read that as you read the story. They end up at this upside down mountain that's in this magic rich zone, and these people are dragon riders because their imaginations are so powerful they can imagine dragons and they are real. Two Flowers, even though they're captured, Two Flowers imagines a dragon as well, and his imagination is so strong because of his innocence at looking at the world that he creates the largest dragon ever. Rincewood escapes and is trying to run away, but Haran, he has this sentient sword that follows him and floats and is like at his back saying, no, you will go back and rescue these people. Maybe that was a precursor to Brandon Sanderson's Nightblood sword. I don't know, maybe. But through this series of events, you have Rincewood and Two Flowers escaping. Haran has his own arc that happens with fighting and winning. But Two Flowers, as they're escaping, he passes out and they're plummeting from Earth. And Death is like, there's nothing you can do about this now. And Rincewood tries to imagine a dragon. And Death is like, you don't believe in dragons. You're not going to be able to. And Rincewood imagines so hard that he teleports he and Two Flowers into our world onto an airplane, which this airplane is the closest thing that he can imagine that is dragon-like within the realm of reality that his mind could comprehend because of how failed he is as a magician. Okay? As they teleport back to the Discworld, he and Two Flowers, they end up in this ocean that's sweeping towards the edge of the world where the oceans just drop off the side. They get swept up into this thing called the circumfence, which is this big barrier. Get it? Circumfence. That is a barrier that sweeps up all this trash from the oceans as this society called the Krull get valuables from it. They then are going to be sacrificed to try to get the gods to give success to this experiment by these people as they're trying to launch a spaceship off the edge of the world to try to determine the sex of Atuin, this giant cosmic turtle that is swimming through space slowly. Through a series of events in the chest appearing and helping them out, Two Flowers ends up getting launched into space instead of being sacrificed, and Rincewood decides to, as things happen, falls off the edge of the earth. Death doesn't appear, but Death has a stand-in who's supposed to do the job but doesn't do it well. And the last thing we see is the Discworld and the turtle floating away as Rincewood plummets into space. And that is the cliffhanger of The Color of Magic. There is a sequel called The Light Fantastic, which no major spoilers about that, but it definitely picks up where it leaves off. Let's just say that the spell in Rincewood's mind isn't done with him yet. And the most ridiculous thing that I remember about that entire book is that there's a society that can levitate rocks into the sky, and they're creating a giant computer that they spent 100 years trying to build that still cannot tell the time. That's its only purpose, is to tell the time correctly. That is ridiculous, and that is absurdism, and that is, in a snapshot, what Discworld is about. Multiple books in this series follows different characters, different stories about you follow stories that are inspired by Hamlet. You have stories that are inspired by the Trojan War. And these vignettes, these stories are so rich and in-depth, and every character that you meet in some way carries a little bit of us. In The Color of Magic, you have Two Flowers who views the world in this very innocent, childlike manner, which I wish more of us could look at. And then you have Rincewood, who's this flawed character who's so determined to escape what fate has for him, but is a coward in the process, that there are times eventually where he overcomes that cowardice and his story develops as the books go on. But we see a lot of ourselves in these characters, which I really love in these very short books. I will say I started off reading the written book a while ago, and I recently read the audiobook, which the voice actor for that is amazing. Just can't recommend it enough. It's short, it's only 7 hours, so if you don't want to use your Audible credits or what for it, but it is an amazing audiobook to go listen to. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment down below if you have read Discworld. What is your favorite book and why? Or who is your favorite character and why? Because as we know, if you've read Discworld, there's a few in there. I would really appreciate it if you liked, comment, subscribed, did all of that stuff. And up next at the end here, if you wanted to click on my intro video, if you wanted to learn more about me, who I am, and my background of how much I love books. We will see you next time, next week, here on the Sanders Review.